Just waiting for people to go in. La 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 la. La 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 la. Sorry, I don't know what this ridiculous humming is. Hello. How are you? Doing okay. It's been an icky day here, and now it's dark. But in general, I'm doing okay. Keeping busy. You know, it's the end of the year, so everything is happening right now. My little bracelet here is a little too... I need to make it a little tighter. Oh, well, that would explain it. It came undone. Hold on. Doot doot. Doot 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 doot. There we go. Hello. Busy can be good. Busy definitely can be good. It depends on what you're busy with, I guess. Yeah, we're good. I think my light maybe needs to be a little more... Yeah. I think it's good. How are you? What? It kicked you out and gave you... It's running ads on this, and it's not even paying me for those ads. That's very rude. Oh. Maybe that's what happened. Maybe it was something to do with keyboard dropping. Yeah. I was going to say, YouTube better give me my money. Hello. It's a happy wintry stream today. I also got wintry looking nails too. That doesn't actually help you look at them at all. Thank you. Are you guys ready to start a new book? Thank you. I'm really excited. I'm sorry that we didn't do it last week. I mentioned it on my social media, but there was a weird electrical thing happening last week. And yeah, it just made it so that it would not have worked out. Yeah, today we're starting Stardust by Neil Gaiman, which is... I read it before, actually, but it won the poll. I wanted to read it again because it's been a while now, and I just really like the book and I like the story. A lot more people, I think, are familiar with the movie. And the really cool thing I like about Neil Gaiman adaptations is that a lot of them, they tend to be faithful to the book up to a point, and then they change things. But they usually change things in a way that's also good. I wouldn't necessarily say that one... I wouldn't fault it for the changes that are made. I think it's... they always make interesting choices for Neil Gaiman stuff. I feel like that's a consistent thing. And yeah, this is no exception. It's going to be new for anybody who's seen the movie. It'll still be new to you probably as we go through it, because there's a lot of stuff that just happens somewhat differently, or like was not in the movie, or it's expounded upon here, or it was expounded upon in the movie versus here, and like it's just interesting how it's different. So this is the copy of the book that I have. And yeah, I of course always recommend buying the book if you can to support the author, because like it's just important. I love doing this to help like expose people to new books that they may have wanted to read but not had time, or even expose people to new authors or books that they just weren't even considering, but they end up falling in love with. But of course, as always, we have to respect the author. They are in our title. So we have to respect them too. And I recommend trying to get the book if you have the chance and if you have the ability. But if not, we will, of course, be reading it out loud. So that is okay too. So let's begin. My copy is older, and it looks like it was even like, I take pretty good care. I like to say I take pretty good care of my books and stuff. This looks like the first couple pages might have been like a little like water damage somehow. And I'm wondering if it's sort of like just by time, like this stuff just happens. I did take this, I think I was in university. It was either in college or in high school. I think college though, that I took this book everywhere with me, because if I had a chance to read it, I would. But I just have it on the go with me. So unfortunately, that might be why it's a little. It's still in good condition, but it might be in less great condition than it could be because of that. So we start off. What I really like about this, by the way, is that there's, if you open up at least this copy, just past the title page, there's an area that says like also by Neil Gaiman, and it talks about other books by Neil Gaiman, but then it's also for, they say, for young readers too. So like there are the books that are a little more mature maybe, and then there's ones that are like appropriate for kids, which I don't know if I agree with. No. I mean, I agree with some of the choices on here. Some of them, like Coraline, I feel is like a little scary maybe for kids. Oh, I forgot to turn off my mail. Let me do that now so we don't get any notification sounds. I always forget to do that. But yeah, so it is a well-loved book, yes. They offer a bunch of other books that you can check out if you like this from Neil Gaiman. I think that's really cool. And also, like, say, yeah, and if you're a kid, or if you're looking for a book for a kid, here's ones that he's written for children or appropriate for children. Okay, so Coraline. I really like this kind of art here. It reminds me of like Old English stuff that I've seen. So it really like plays into the theme of making it feel more from the time period that it's supposed to be in. Okay, and then there's a song by John Donne that is here at the start of the book. Go and catch a falling star, get with child a mandrake root. Tell me where all past years are, or who cleft the devil's foot. Teach me to hear mermaids singing, or to keep off envy's stinging, and find what wind serves to advance an honest mind. If thou beest born to strange sights, things invisible to see, ride 10,000 days and nights till age snow white hairs on thee. Thou, when thou returnest, wilt tell me all strange wonders that befell thee, and swear nowhere lives a woman true and fair. If thou findest one, let me know. Such a pilgrimage were sweet, yet do not, I would not go. Though at next door we might meet. Though she were true when you met her, at last till you write your letter, yet she will be false ere I come to 2 or 3. All right, John Donne. Just some casual sort of like misogyny in the John Donne stuff. Who hurt you, sir? But anyway, and we have our little chapter art here for. Is it chapter 1 or is it like broken up into sections? That I can't remember. It seems to be a book that is broken up into sections, perhaps. All right, cool. All right, so there's section 1, I suppose, in which we learn of the village of Wall and of the curious thing that occurs there every 9 years. There was once a young man who wished to gain his heart's desire, and while that is, as beginnings go, not entirely novel, for every tale about every young man there ever was or will be could start in a similar manner, there is much about this young man and what happened to him that was unusual, although even he never knew the whole of it. The tale started, as many tales have started, in Wall. The town of Wall stands today as it stood for 600 years on a high jut of granite amidst a small forest woodland. The houses of Wall are square and old, built of gray stone, with dark slate roofs and high chimneys. Taking advantage of every inch of space on the rock, the houses lean into each other, are built one upon the next, with here and there a bush or tree growing out of the side of a building. Oh, interesting. There is one road from Wall, a winding track rising sharply up from the forest, where it is lined with rocks and small stones. Followed far enough south, out of the forest, the track becomes a real road, paved with asphalt. Followed further, the road gets larger, is packed at all hours with cars and trucks rushing from city to city. Eventually, the road takes you to London, but London is a whole night's drive from Wall. The inhabitants of Wall are a taciturn breed, falling into 2 distinct types: the native Wall folk, as gray and tall and stocky as the granite outcrop their town was built upon, and the others who have made Wall their home over the years, and their descendants. Below Wall, on the west, is a forest. To the south is a treacherously placid lake served by the streams that drop from the hills behind Wall to the north. There are fields upon the hills on which sheep graze. To the east is more woodland. Immediately to the east of Wall is a high gray rocky wall from which the town takes its name. This wall is old, built of rough, square lumps of hewn granite, and it comes from the woods and goes back. To the woods once more. There is only one break in the wall, an opening about 6 feet in width. Hold on, I keep stammering on my words here. Sorry about that. There is only one break in the wall, an opening about 6 feet in width, a little to the north of the village. Through the gap in the wall can be seen a large green meadow, beyond the meadow, a stream, and beyond the stream there are trees. From time to time shapes and figures can be seen amongst the trees in the distance, huge shapes and odd shapes and small glimmering things which flash and glitter and are gone. Although it is perfectly good meadowland, none of the villagers has ever grazed animals on the meadow on the other side of the wall, nor have they used it for growing crops. Instead, for hundreds, perhaps for thousands of years, they have posted guards on each side of the opening on the wall, and done their best to put it out of their minds. Even today, 2 townsmen stand on each side of the opening, night and day, taking 8-hour shifts. They carry hefty wooden cudgels. They flank the opening on the town side. Their main function is to prevent the town's children from going through the opening, into the meadow, and beyond. Occasionally they are called upon to discourage a solitary rambler, or one of the few visitors to the town from going through the gateway. See, this is something where it's like really different from the movie, because if you've seen the movie, you know it's just like one lone old man who's guarding the wall, and you can assume that he probably was chosen when he was a much younger man, but they should have had more guards and also like maybe replace their guard every now and then. You would think that they would do that. The children they discourage simply with displays of the cudgel. Where ramblers and visitors are concerned, they are more inventive, only using physical force as a last resort if tales of new planted grass or a dangerous bull on the loose are not sufficient. Very rarely someone comes to wall knowing what they are looking for, and these people they will sometimes allow through. There is a look in the eyes, and once seen, it cannot be mistaken. There have been no cases of smuggling across the wall in all the 20th century that the townsfolk know of, and they pride themselves on this. The guard is relaxed once every 9 years, on May Day, when a fair comes to the meadow. It's really interesting because this reminds me, so with the chapter title being In Which This, and then also talking about May Day, and another part of the, like the other side of the wall and such, it reminds me of Howl's Moving Castle. And I'm wondering, I want to go and look to see like which one came first and if one might have been inspired by the other. Yeah. The events that followed transpired many years ago. Queen Victoria was on the throne of England, but she was not yet the black-clad widow of Windsor. She had apples in her cheeks and a spring in her step, and Lord Melbourne often had cause to upbraid gently the young queen for her flightiness. She was, as yet, unmarried, although she was very much in love. Mr. Charles Dickens was serializing his novel Oliver Twist. Mr. Draper had just taken the first photograph of the moon, freezing her pale face on cold paper. Mr. Morse had recently announced a way of transmitting messages down metal wires. Had you mentioned magic or fairy to any of them, they would have smiled at you disdainfully, except perhaps for Mr. Dickens, at the time a young man and beardless. He would have looked at you wistfully. People were coming to the British Isles for that spring. They came in ones, and they came in twos, and they landed at Dover or in London or in Liverpool. Men and women with skins as pale as paper, skins as dark as volcanic rocks, skins the color of cinnamon, speaking in a multitude of tongues. They arrived all through April, and they traveled by steam train, by horse, by caravan or cart, and many of them walked. At that time, Tristran Thorn was 18, and he was not a romantic. He had nut-brown hair, and nut-brown eyes, and nut-brown freckles. He was middling tall and slow of speech. He had an easy smile which illuminated his face from within, and he dreamed, when he daydreamed in his father's meadow, of leaving the village of Wall and all its unpredictable charm and going to London or Edinburgh. Edinburgh? Why can't I not, I know that freaking, that name. Why can't I just pronounce it right today? Or Edinburgh, or Dublin, or some great town where nothing was dependent on which way the wind was blowing. Edinburgh. Okay. Edinburgh? It's B-U-R. You reverse the... Oh, so you pronounce it Edinburgh even though it's... Oh, Edinburgh. You never know with, older English things. He worked on his father's farm and owned nothing save a small cottage and a far field given to him by his parents. Visitors were coming to Wall that April for the fair, and Dunstan resented them. Mr. Bromios's inn, the Seventh Magpie, normally a warren of empty rooms, had filled a week earlier, and now the strangers had begun to take rooms in the farms and private houses, paying for their lodgings with strange coins, with herbs and spices, and even with gemstones. As the day of the fair approached, the atmosphere of anticipation mounted. People were walking earlier, counting days, counting minutes. People were waking earlier, counting days, counting minutes. The guards on the gate at the sides of the wall were restive and nervous. Figures and shadows moved in the trees at the edge of the meadow. In the seventh magpie, Bridget Comfrey, who was widely regarded as the most beautiful pot girl in living memory, was provoking friction between Tommy Forrester, with whom she had been seen to step out over the previous year, and a huge man with dark eyes and a small, chittering monkey. The man spoke little English, but he smiled expressively whenever Bridget came by. In the pub's tap room, the regulars sat in In the pub's tap room, the regulars sat in awkward proximity to the visitors, speaking so. It's only every 9 years. They say in the old days it was every year at midsummer. Ask Mr. Brimios, he'll know. Mr. Brimios was tall, and his skin was olive. His black hair was curled tightly on his head. His eyes were green. As the girls of the village became women, they took notice of Mr. Brimios, but he did not return their notice. It was said he had come to the village quite some time ago, a visitor. But he had stayed in the village, and his wine was good, so the locals agreed. A loud argument broke out in the public lounge between Tommy Forrester and the dark-eyed man, whose name appeared to be Alum Bay. "Stop them! In the name of heaven, stop them!" shouted Bridget. "They're going out the back to fight over me!" And she tossed her head prettily so that the light of the oil lamps caught her perfect golden curls. Edinburgh. Yeah. So it actually makes sense that you would hear it both ways, because Edinburgh sounds like Edinburgh, but if you just said it very quickly. Like, you didn't linger on the middle of the name. Yeah. Nobody moved to stop the men, although a number of people, villagers and newcomers alike, went outside to spectate, as you would. Tommy Forrester removed his shirt and raised his fists in front of him. The stranger laughed and spat into the grass, and then he seized Tommy's right hand and sent him flying onto the ground, chin first. Tommy clambered to his feet and ran at the stranger. He landed a glancing blow on the man's cheek before finding himself face down in the dirt, his face being slammed into the mud, with the wind knocked out of him. Alum Bey sat on top of him and chuckled and said something in Arabic. That quickly and that easily, the fight was over. Alum Bey climbed off Tommy Forrester, and he strutted over to Bridget Comfrey, bowed low to her, and grinned with gleaming teeth. Bridget ignored him and ran to Tommy. "Why, whatever has he done to you, my sweet?" she asked, and mopped the mud from his face with her apron and called him all manner of endearments. Alum Bey went with the spectators back into the public rooms of the inn, and he graciously bought Tommy Forrester a bottle of Mr. Bromios's Chablis? Chablis. Chablis. Is it French? Has the French come back to torment me? Chablis. Blis, rather. Chablis. It is French, isn't it? I bet it's French. Does it not? Because when you do like Lis and then pronounce it more like E, yeah, that is French. Chablis. Chablis, probably. Why is it always French? Why is it always French? Yeah, it does. Lis, I've seen that before, like that kind of ending where there's an is, but it's pronounced E. I've seen just is. I don't know. Well, Chablis. Graciously bought Tommy Forrester a bottle of Mr. Bromio's Chablis when Tommy returned. Neither of them was quite certain who had won, who had lost. Tristran Thorn was not in the Seventh Magpie that evening. He was a practical lad who had, for the last 6 months, been courting Daisy Hempstock, a young woman of similar practicality. They would walk on fair evenings around the village and discuss the theory of crop rotation and the weather and other such sensible matters. And on these walks, upon which they were invariably accompanied by Daisy's mother and younger sister walking a healthy 6 paces behind, they would from time to time stare at each other lovingly. At the door to the Hemstocks, Dunstan would pause and bow and take his farewell. And Daisy Hemstock would walk into her house and remove her bonnet and say, "I do so wish Mr. Thorn would make up his mind to propose. I am sure Papa would not be adverse to it." "Indeed, I am sure that he would not," said Daisy's mamma on this evening, as she said on every such evening, and she removed her own bonnet and her gloves and led her daughters to the drawing-room, in which a very tall gentleman with a very long black beard was sitting, sorting through his pack. Daisy and her mamma and her sister bobbed curtsies to the gentleman, who spoke little English and had arrived a few days before. The temporary lodger, in his turn, stood and bowed to them, then returned to his pack of wooden oddments, sorting, arranging, and polishing. Ah, interesting. Nah, you're fine. It was chilly that April, with the awkward changeability of English spring. The visitors came up the narrow road through the forest from the south. They filled the spare rooms. They bunked out in cow byres and barns. Some of them raised colored tents. Some of them arrived in their own caravans drawn by huge gray horses or by small shaggy ponies. In the forest, there was a carpet of bluebells. On the morning of April the 29th, Dunstan Thorn drew guard duty on the gap in the wall with Tommy Forrester. They stood on each side of the gap in the wall, and they waited. Dunstan had done guard duty many times before, but hitherto his task had consisted of simply standing and, on occasion, shooing away children. Today he felt important. He held a wooden cudgel, and as each stranger to the village came up to the break in the wall, Dunstan or Tommy would say, "Tomorrow, tomorrow. No one's coming through today, good sirs." And the strangers would retreat a little way and stare through the break in the wall at the unassuming meadow beyond it, at the unexceptional trees that dotted the meadow, at the rather dull forest behind it. Some of them attempted to strike up conversations with Dunstan or Tommy, but the young men, proud of their status as guards, declined to converse, contenting themselves by raising their heads, tightening their lips, and generally looking important. At lunchtime, Daisy Hemstock brought by a small pot of shepherd's pie for them both, and Bridget Comfrey brought them each a mug of spiced ale. And at twilight, another 2 able-bodied young men of the village arrived to relieve them, carrying a lantern each, and Tommy and Dunstan walked down to the inn, where Mr. Bromios gave each of them a mug of his best ale, and his best ale was very fine indeed, as the reward for doing guard duty. There was a buzz of excitement in the inn, now crowded beyond believing. It was filled with visitors to the village from every nation in the world, or so it seemed to Dunstan, who had no sense of distance beyond the woods that surrounded the village of Wall. So he regarded the tall gentleman in the black top hat at the table beside him, all the way up from London, with as much awe as he regarded the taller ebony-colored gentleman in the white one-piece robe with whom he was dining. Dunstan knew it was rude to stare, and that, as a villager of Wall, he had every right to feel superior to all of the foreigners. But he could smell unfamiliar spices on the air and hear men and women speaking to each other in 100 tongues, and he gawked and gazed unashamedly. The man in the black silk top hat noticed that Dunstan was staring at him and motioned the lad over to him. "Do you like treacle pudding?" he asked abruptly, by the way of introduction. Mutnabi was called away, and there's more pudding here than a man can manage on his own. Dunstan nodded. The treacle pudding was steaming invitingly on its plate. "Well, then," said his new friend, "help yourself." He passed Dunstan a clean china bowl and a spoon. Dunstan needed no further encouragement, and he began to demolish the pudding. "Now, young'un," said the tall gentleman in the black silk top hat to Dunstan, once their bowls and the pudding plates were quite empty. "It seemed the inn has no more rooms, also that every room in the village has already been let." "Is that so?" said Dunstan, unsurprised. "That it is," said the gentleman in the top hat. And what I was wondering was, would you know of a house that might have a room? Dunstan shrugged. All the rooms have gone by now, he said. I remember when I was a boy of 9, my mother and my father sent me to sleep out in the rafters of the cow byre for a week and let my room to a lady from the Orient and her family and servants. She left me a kite as a thank you, and I flew it from the meadow until one day it snapped its string and flew away into the sky. Where do you live now? Asked the gentleman in the top hat. I have a cottage on the edge of my father's land, Dunstan replied. It was our shepherd's cottage until he died 2 years ago, last Lammas-tide, and my parents gave it to me. Take me to it, said the gentleman in the top hat, and it did not occur to Dunstan to refuse him. The spring moon was high and bright, and the night was clear. They walked down from the village into to the forest beneath it, and they walked the whole way past the Thorn family farm, where the gentleman in the top hat was startled by a cow sleeping in the meadow, which snorted as it dreamed, until they reached Dunstan's cottage. It had one room and a fireplace. The stranger nodded. I like this well enough, he said. Come, Tristran Thorn, I'll rent it from you for the next 3 days. What do you give me for it? A gold sovereign, a silver sixpence, a copper penny, and a fresh shiny farthing, said the man. Now, a golden sovereign for 2 nights was more than a fair rent in the days when a farm worker might hope to make £15 in a good year. Still, Dunstan hesitated. If you're here for the market, he told the tall man, then it's miracles and wonders you'll be trading. The tall man nodded. So it would be miracles and wonders that we would be after, is it? He looked around Dunstan's one-room cottage again. It began to rain then, a gentle pattering on the thatch above them. Oh, very well, said the tall gentleman a trifle testily. A miracle, a wonder. Tomorrow you shall attain your heart's desire. Now, here is your money, and he took it from Dunstan's ear with one easy gesture. Dunstan touched it to the iron nail on the cottage door, checking for fairy gold. Then he bowed low to the gentleman and walked off into the rain. He tied the money up in his handkerchief. Dunstan walked to the cow byre in the pelting rain. He climbed into the hayloft and was soon asleep. He was aware in the night of thunder and lightning, although he did not wake, and then, in the small hours of the morning, he was woken by someone treading awkwardly on his feet. Sorry, said a voice. That is to say, excuse me. Who's that? Who's there? Said Dunstan. Just me, said the voice. I'm here for the market. I was sleeping in a hollow tree for the night, but the lightning toppled it, cracked it like an egg it did, and smashed it like a twig, and the rain got down on my neck. And it threatened to get into my baggage, and there's things in there must be kept dry as dust. And I kept it as safe as houses on all my travellings here, though it was wet as water, suggested Dunstan. Ever so, continued the voice in the darkness. So I was wondering, it continued, if you'd mind me staying here under your roof, as I'm not very big, and I'd not disturb you or nothing. Just don't tread on me, sighed Dunstan. It was then that a flash of lightning illuminated the byre, and in the light, Dunstan saw something small and hairy at the corner, wearing a large floppy hat. And then darkness. I hope I'm not disturbing you, said the voice, which certainly sounded rather hairy now Dunstan thought about it. You aren't, said Dunstan, who was very tired. That's good, said the hairy voice, because I wouldn't want to disturb you. Please, begged Dunstan, let me sleep, please. There was a snuffling noise, which was replaced by a gentle snoring. Dunstan rolled over in the hay. The person, whatever it was, farted, scratched itself, and began to snore once more. Dunstan listened to the rain on the byre roof, and thought about Daisy Hemstock, and in his thoughts they were walking together, and 6 steps behind them walked a tall man with a top hat and a small, furry creature whose face Dunstan could not see. They were off to see his heart's desire, rather. There was bright sunlight on his face, and the cow byre was empty. He washed his face and walked up to the farmhouse. He put on his very best jacket and his very best shirt and his very best breeches. He scratched the mud from his boots with his pocket knife. Then he walked into the farm kitchen and kissed his mother on the cheek and helped himself to a cottage loaf and a large pat of fresh churned butter. And then, with his money tied up in his fine Sunday cambric handkerchief, he walked up to the village of Wall and bade good morning to the guards on the gate. Through the gap in the wall, he could see colored tents being raised, stalls being erected, colored flags, and people walking back and forth. "We're not to let anyone through until midday," said the guard. Dunstan shrugged and went into the pub, where he pondered what he would buy with his savings, the shiny half-crown he had saved, and the lucky sixpence with a hole drilled through it on a leather thong around his neck, and with the additional pocket handkerchief filled with coins. He had, for the moment, quite forgotten there had been anything else promised the night before. At the stroke of midday, Dunstan strode up to the wall and, nervously, as if he were breaking the greatest of taboos, he walked through beside, as he realized, the gentleman in the black silk top hat, who nodded to him. "Ah, my landlord, and how are you today, sir?" "Very well," said Dunstan. "Walk with me," said the tall man. "Let us walk together." They walked across the meadow towards the tents. "Have you been here before?" asked the tall man. "I went to the last market 9 years ago." "I was only a boy," admitted Dunstan. "Well," said his tenant, "remember to be polite and take no gifts. Remember that you're a guest. And now I shall give you the last part of the rent that I owe you, for I swore an oath. And my gifts last a long time. You and your firstborn child and his or her You and your firstborn child and his or her why can't I say that? You and your firstborn child and his or her firstborn? Why can't I say this stupid sentence? His or her firstborn child. It's a gift that will last as long as I live." "And what would that be, sir?" "Your heart's desire, remember," said the gentleman in the top hat. "Your heart's desire." Dunstan bowed, and they walked on toward the fair. "Eyes! Eyes! New eyes for old!" shouted a tiny woman in front of a table covered with bottles and jars filled with eyes of every kind and color. "Instruments of music from 100 lands! Penny whistles! Tuppenny hums! 3-penny choral anthems! Try your luck, step right up, answer a simple riddle and win a windflower! Everlasting lavender, bluebell cloth! Bottled dreams, a shilling a bottle! Coat of nights, coat of twilight, coats of dusk! Swords of fortune, wands of power, rings of eternity, cards of grace, roll up, step this way! Salves and ointments, philtres and nostrums." Dunstan paused in front of a stall covered with tiny crystal ornaments. He examined the miniature animals, pondering getting one for Daisy Hemstock. Sorry, just saw the comment. He picked up a crystal cat no bigger than his thumb. Sagely, it blinked at him, and he dropped it, shocked. It righted itself in midair and, like a real cat, fell on its 4 paws. Then it stalked over to the corner of the stall and began to wash itself. Dunstan walked on through the thronged market. It was bustling with people. All the strangers who had come to Wall in the previous weeks were there, and many of the inhabitants of the town of Wall as well. Mr. Bromius had set up a wine tent and was selling wines and pasties to the village folk, who were often tempted by the foods being sold to the folk from beyond the Wall, but had been told by their grandparents, who had got it from their grandparents, that it was deeply, utterly wrong to eat fairy food, to eat fairy fruit, to drink fairy water, and sip fairy wine. For every 9 years, the folks from beyond the Wall and over the hill set up their stalls, and for a day and a night the meadow played host to the fairy market. And there was, for 1 day and 1 night in 9 years, commerce between the nations. There were wonders for sale, and marvels, and miracles. There were things undreamed of and objects unimagined. What need, Dunstan wondered, could someone have of the storm-filled eggshells? He jingled his money in his pocket handkerchief, and looked for something small and inexpensive with which to amuse Daisy. He heard a gentle chiming in the air above the hubbub of the market, and this he walked toward. He passed a stall in which 5 huge men were dancing to the music of Lugubrious? I'm gonna Google how to pronounce that. Lugubrious. Okay, interesting. Lugubrious. What an interesting word. And let me double check the meaning of it, because I don't think I've ever seen that. Looking or sounding sad and dismal. Okay. Lugubrious hurdy-gurdy being played by a mournful-looking black bear. He passed a stall where a balding man in a brightly colored kimono was smashing china plates and tossing them into a burning bowl from which colored smoke was pouring, all the while calling out to the passerby. The chinkling chiming grew louder. Reaching the stall from which the sound was emanating, he saw that it was deserted. It was festooned with flowers, bluebells and foxgloves and harebells and daffodils, but also with violets and lilies, with tiny crimson dog roses, pale snowdrops, blue forget-me-nots, and a profusion of other flowers Dunstan could not name. Each flower was made of glass or crystal, spun or carved, he could not tell. They counterfeited life perfectly, and they chimed and jingled like distant glass bells. "Hello," called Dunstan. "Good morrow to you on this market day," "Good morrow to you on this market day," said the stall holder, clambering down from the painted caravan parked behind the stall, and she smiled widely at him with white teeth and a dusky face. She was one of the folk from beyond the wall. He could tell at once from her eyes and her ears, which were visible beneath her curly black hair. Her eyes were a deep violet, whilst her ears were the ears of a cat, perhaps gently curved and dusted with a fine dark fur. She was quite beautiful. Dunstan picked up a flower from the stall. "It's very lovely," he said. It was a violet, and it clinkled and sang as he held it, making a noise similar to that produced by wetting a finger and rubbing it gently around a wine glass. "How much is it?" She shrugged, and a delightful shrug it was. "The cost is never discussed at the outset," she told him. "It might be a great deal more than you are prepared to pay, and then you would leave, and we would both be the poorer for it. Let us discuss the merchandise in a more general way." Dunstan paused. It was then that the gentleman with the black silk top hat passed by the stall. "There," he murmured Dunstan's lodger. "My debt to you is settled, and my rent is paid in full." Dunstan shook his head as if to clear it of a dream and turned back to the young lady. "So, where did these flowers come from?" he asked. She smiled knowingly. On the side of Mount Calamon, a grove of glass flowers grows. The journey there is perilous, and the journey back is more so. "And of what purpose are they?" asked Dunstan. "The use and function of these flowers is chiefly decorative and recreational. They bring pleasure. They can be given to a loved one as a token of admiration and affection, and the sound they make is pleasing to the ear. Also, they catch the light most delightfully." She held a bluebell up to the light, and Dunstan could not but observe that the color of sunlight glittered through the purple crystal with could not but observe that the color of sunlight glittering through the purple crystal was inferior in both hue and shade to that of her eyes. "I see," said Dunstan. "They are also used in certain spells and cantrips." "If Sir is a magician?" Dunstan shook his head. There was, he noticed, something remarkable about the young lady. "Ah, even so, they are delightful things," she said, and smiled again. The remarkable thing was a thin silver chain that ran from the young lady's wrist down to her ankle and into the painted caravan behind her. Dunstan remarked upon it. "The chain? Oh, the chain. It binds me to the stall. I am the personal slave of the witch woman who owns the stall. She caught me many years ago, as I played by the waterfalls of my father's lands, high in the mountains, luring me on and on in the form of a pretty frog always but a moment out of my reach, until I had left my father's lands, unwittingly, whereupon she resumed her true shape, and popped me into a sack." "And you are her slave forever?" "Not forever." And at that the fairy girl smiled. "I gain my freedom on the day that the moon loses her daughter, if that occurs in a week when 2 Mondays come together. I await it with patience, and in the meantime I do as I am bid, and also I dream." "Will you buy a flower from me now, young master?" "My name is Dunstan, and an honest name it is, too," she said with a teasing grin. "Where are your pincers, Master Dunstan?" "Will you catch the devil by the nose?" "And what is your name?" asked Dunstan, blushing a deep red. "I no longer have a name." I am a slave, and the name I had was taken from me. I answer to hey you, or to girl, or to foolish slattern, or to many other imprecation. Dunstan noticed how the silken fabric of her robe pressed itself against her body. He was aware of elegant curves and of her violet eyes upon him, and he swallowed. Dunstan put his hand in his pocket and pulled out his handkerchief. He could no longer look at the woman. He tumbled out his money and onto the counter. Take enough for this, he said, picking a pure white snowdrop from the table. We do not take money at this stall. She pushed the coins back to him. No? What will you take? For by now he was quite agitated, and his only mission was to obtain a flower for Daisy Hempstock. To obtain his flower and to depart, for, truth to tell, the young lady was making him exceedingly uncomfortable. I could take the color of your hair, she said, or all of your memories from before you were 3 years of age. I could take the hearing from your left ear. Not all of it, just enough that you'd not enjoy music or appreciate the running of a river or the sowing of the land. Dunstan shook his head. Or a kiss from you. One kiss, here on my cheek. That I'll pay with goodwill, said Dunstan, and with that he leaned across the stall amid the twinkling jingling of the crystal flowers and planted a chaste kiss on her soft cheek. He smelled the scent of her then, intoxicating, magical. It filled the front of his head and his chest and his mind. There now, she said, and she passed him his snowdrop. He took it with hands and that suddenly seemed to him to be huge and clumsy and not at all small and in every way perfect like the hands of the fairy girl. And I'll see you back here tonight, Dunstan Thorn, when the moon goes down. Come here and hoot like a little owl. Can you do that? He nodded and stumbled away from her. He did not need to ask how she knew his surname. She had taken it from him along with certain other things, such as his heart, when he had kissed her. The snowdrop chimed in his hand. Now we're on this next little section here. Why, Dunstan Thorn, said Daisy Hempstock when he encountered her by Mr. Bromius's tent, sitting with her family and Dunstan's parents, eating great brown sausages and drinking porter. Whatever is the matter? I brought you a gift, Dunstan muttered, and thrust the chiming snowdrop toward her. It glinted in the afternoon sunlight. She took it from him, puzzled, with fingers still shiny with sausage grease. Impulsively, Dunstan leaned forward, and, in front of her mother and father and sister, in front of Bridget Comfrey and Mr. Barrios and all, he kissed her on her fair cheek. The outcry was predictable, but Mr. Hempstock, who had not lived on the border of fairy and the lands beyond for 57 years for nothing, exclaimed, Hush now! Look at his eyes! Can't you see the poor boy's dazed in his wits, dazed and confused? He's bespelled, I'll wager you. Hoy! Tommy Forrester, come here! Take young Dunstan Thorn back to the village and keep an eye on him. Let him sleep if he wishes, or talk if it's talk that he needs. Tommy walked Dunstan out of the market and back to the village wall. There now, Daisy, said her mother, stroking her hair. He's just a little elf touch, that's all. No need to take on so. And she pulled a lace kerchief from her capacious bosom and dabbed at her daughter's cheeks, which had suddenly become covered with tears. Daisy looked up at her and seized the handkerchief and blew her nose upon it and sniffled into it. And Mrs. Hempstock observed with a certain perplexity that Daisy appeared to be smiling through her tears. But Mother, Dunstan kissed me, said Daisy Hempstock, and she fixed the crystal snowdrop at the front of her bonnet, where it chimed and glistened. Will he know that you want him to do it again with that kind of reaction? Like, sounds like you did something wrong. After some time spent searching for it, Mr. Hempstock and Dunstan's father found the stall where the crystal flowers were being sold, but the stall was being run by an elderly woman accompanied by an exotic and very beautiful bird, which was chained to its perch by a thin silver chain. There was no reasoning with the old woman, for when they tried to question her about what had happened to Dunstan, all her talk was of one of the prizes of her collection, given away by a good for nothing, and that was what came of ingratitude and of these sad modern times and of today's servants. So she gave away a very valuable flower. Hold on, I'm just going to take some water. And anybody else watching at this point should take water too. Just saying. I'm sorry if my reading is a little off today. I hope it's okay. Do you have anything to drink? You should take something to drink. It's important to stay hydrated. Kayla, get yourself something to drink. You should have something to drink. It's a long while that we're reading for. You should have something in general. Yeah, see? You need to keep hydrated. It's important. You should get water next time. It's important. Fine though, if you insist, I'll keep going now. But seriously, next time, if you don't have water, we break until you get it. Okay. In the empty village, for who'd be in the village during the fairy market, Dunstan was taken into the 7th Magpie and given a wooden settle on which to sit. He rested his forehead on his hand and stared off into no one knows where, and from time to time sighed huge sighs like the wind. Tommy Forrester tried to talk to him, saying, "Now then, old fellow, buck up, that's the ticket, let's see a smile, eh? How's about something to eat, then? Or something to drink? No? My word, you do look queer, Dunstan, old fellow." But gaining no response of any kind, Tommy began to pine after the market himself, where even now, he rubbed his tender jaw, the lovely Bridget was undoubtedly being escorted by some huge and imposing gentleman with exotic clothes and a little monkey that chittered. And having assured himself that his friend would be safe in the empty inn, Tommy walked back through the village to the gap in the wall. As Tommy re-entered the market, he observed that the place was a hubbub. A wild place of puppet shows, of jugglers and dancing animals, of horses for auction, and all kinds of things for sale or barter. Later, at twilight, a different kind of people came out. There was a crier who cried news as a modern newspaper prints headlines. "The Master of Stormold suffers a mysterious malady. The Hill of Fire has moved to the fastness of Dean. The Squire of Garamond's only heir is transformed into a grunting pigwidgeon." And would, for a coin, expand further on these stories. The sun set. Sorry, I gotta scratch my arm. The sun set and a huge spring moon appeared, high already in the heavens. A chill breeze blew. Now the traders retreated into their tents, and the visitors to the market found themselves whispered at, invited to partake of numerous wonders, each available for a price. And whispered at. And as the moon came low on the horizon, Tristran Thorn walked quietly down the cobbled streets of the village wall. He passed many a merrymaker, visitor or foreigner, although few enough of them observed him as he walked. He slipped through the gap in the wall, thick it was, the wall, and Dunstan found himself wondering, as his father had before him, what would happen were he to walk along the top of it. Through the gap and into the meadow, and that night, for the first time in his life, Dunstan entertained thoughts of continuing on through the meadow, of crossing the stream and vanishing into the trees on its far side. He entertained these thoughts awkwardly, as a man entertains unexpected guests. Then, as he reached his objective, he pushed these thoughts away, as a man apologizes to his guests, and leaves them, muttering something about a prior engagement. The moon was setting. Dunstan raised his hands to his mouth and hooted. There was no response. The sky above was a deep color, blue perhaps, or purple, not black, sprinkled with more stars than the mind could hold. He hooted once more. "That," she said severely in his ear, "is nothing like a little owl. A snowy owl it could be, a barn owl even. If my ears were stopped up with twigs, perhaps I'd imagine it an eagle owl. But it's not a little owl." Dunstan shrugged and grinned a little foolishly. The fairy woman sat down beside him. She intoxicated him. He was breathing her, sensing her through the pores of his skin. She leaned close to him. Do you think that you are under a spell, pretty Dunstan? I do not know. She laughed, and the sound was a clear rill bubbling over rocks and stones. You are under no spell, pretty boy, pretty boy. She lay back in the grass and stared up at the sky. Your stars, she asked. What are they like? Dunstan lay beside her in the cool grass and stared up at the night sky. There was certainly something odd about the stars. Perhaps there was more color in them, for they glittered like tiny gems. Perhaps there was something about the number of tiny stars, the constellation. Something was strange and wonderful about the stars. But then they lay back to back, staring up at the sky. What do you want from life? Asked the fairy lass. I don't know, he admitted. You, I think. I want my freedom, she said. Dunstan reached down to the silver chain that ran from her wrist to her ankle and off away in the grass. He tugged on it. It was stronger than it looked. It was fashioned of cat's breath and fish scales and moonlight mixed in with the silver, she told him, unbreakable until the terms of the spell are concluded. Oh. He moved back onto the grass. I should not mind it, for it is a long, long chain, but the knowledge of it irks me, and I miss my father's land, and the witch woman is not the best of mistresses. And she was quiet. Dunstan leaned over toward her, reached a hand up to her face, felt something wet and hot splash against his hand. Why are you crying? Why, you were crying, rather. She said nothing. Dunstan pulled her toward him, wiping ineffectually at her face with his big hand, and then he leaned into her sobbing face and tentatively, uncertain of whether or not he was doing the correct thing given the circumstances, he kissed her, full upon her burning lips. There was a moment of hesitation, and then her mouth opened against his, and her tongue slid into his mouth, and he was under the strange stars, utterly, irrevocably lost. He had kissed before with the girls of the village, but he had gone no further. His hand felt her small... How far do we go with this? His hand felt her small breast through the silk of her dress, touched the rims of her nipples. She clung to him hard, as if he were drowning, fumbling with his shirt, with his breeches. Okay. As I read ahead to see where we're going with this. Give me a moment as I just make sure. As I give us waiting music. Okay. She was so small, he was scared he would hurt her and break her. He did not. She wriggled and writhed beneath him, gasping and kicking, and guiding him with her hand. She placed 100 burning kisses on his face and chest, and then she was above him, straddling him, gasping and laughing, sweating and slippery as a minnow, and he was arching and pushing and exulting, his head full of her, and only her, and had he known her name, he would have called it out loud. At the end, he would... I'm gonna, skip this stuff. You know what they did. It's well written. You should read the book yourself. Then they lay together side by side. The fairy woman adjusted her silk robe and was once more decorously covered. Dunstan pulled his breeches back up with great regret. Or with regret. It doesn't say great regret. I can just tell. He squeezed her small hand in his. The sweat dried on his skin, and he felt chilled and lonely. He could see her now, as the sky lightened into a dawn gray. Around them, animals were stirring, horses stamped, birds began waking to sing the dawn in, and here and there, across the market meadow, those in the tents were beginning to rise and move. Now get along with you, she said softly, and looked at him half regretfully, with eyes as violet as the cirrus clouds high in the dawn sky. And she kissed him gently on the mouth with lips that tasted of crushed blackberries. Then she stood up and walked back into the gypsy caravan behind the stall. Dazed and alone, Dunstan walked through the market, feeling a great deal older than his 18 years. He returned to the cow byre, took off his boots, and slept until he woke, when the sun was high in the sky. On the following day, the market finished, although Dunstan did not return to it, and the foreigners left the village, and life in Wall returned to normal, which was perhaps slightly less normal than life in most villages, particularly when the wind was in the wrong direction, but was, all things considered, normal enough. 2 weeks after the market, Tommy Forrester proposed marriage to Bridget Comfrey, and she accepted, and the week after that, Mrs. Hemstock came to visit Mrs. Thorn of a morning. They took tea in the parlor. "It is a blessing about the Forrester boy," said Mrs. Hemstock. "That it is," said Mrs. Thorn. "Have another scone, my dear. I expect your Daisy shall be a bridesmaid." "I trust she shall," said Mrs. Hemstock, "if she should live so long." Mrs. Thorn looked up, alarmed. "Why, she is not ill, Mrs. Hemstock." "Say it is not so." "She does not eat, Mrs. Thorn. She wastes away. She drinks a little water from time to time." "Oh, my," Mrs. Hemstock went on. "Last night I finally discovered the cause. It is your Dunstan." "Dunstan? He is not—" Mrs. Thorn raised one hand to her mouth. "Oh, no," said Mrs. Hemstock, hastily shaking her head and pursing her lips. "Nothing like that. He has ignored her. She's not seen him for days and days. She has taken it into her head that he no longer cares for her, and all she does is hold the snowdrop he gave her, and she sobs." Mrs. Thorn measured out more tea from the jar into the pot and added hot water. "Truth to tell," she admitted, "we're a little concerned about Dunstan, Thorny and me. He's been mooning. That's the only word for it. His work isn't getting done. Thorny was saying he needs some settling down, that boy. If he'd but settled down, why, Thorny was saying he'd settle all the way westward meadows on the lad. He'd settle all the westward meadows on the lad." Mrs. Hemstock nodded slowly. "Hemstock would certainly not be averse to seeing our Daisy happy. Certain he'd settle a flock of our sheep on that girl." The Hemstock's sheep were notoriously the finest for miles around, shaggy-coated and intelligent for sheep, with curling horns and sharp hooves. Mrs. Hemstock and Mrs. Thorn sipped their tea, and so it was settled. Dunstan Thorn was married in June to Daisy Hemstock, and if the groom seemed a little distracted, well, the bride was as glowing and lovely as ever any bride had been. Behind them, their fathers discussed the plans for the farmhouse they would build for the newlyweds in the western meadow. Their mothers agreed how lovely Daisy looked, and what a pity it was that Dunstan had stopped Daisy from wearing the snowdrop he had bought for her at the market at the end of April in her wedding dress. And it is there we will leave them, in a falling flurry of rose petals, scarlet and yellow and pink and white. Or almost. They lived in Dunstan's cottage while their little farmhouse was erected, and they were certainly happy enough. And the day-to-day business of raising sheep and herding sheep and shearing them and nursing them slowly took the faraway look from Dunstan's eyes. First autumn came, then winter. It was at the end of February, in lambing season, when the world was cold, and a bitter wind howled down the moors and through the leafless forest, when icy rains fell from the leaden skies in continual drizzling showers, at 6 in the evening, after the sun had set and the sky was dark, that a wicker basket was pushed through the space in the wall. The guards, on each side of the gap, at first did not notice the basket. They were facing the wrong way, after all, and it was dark and wet, and they were busy stamping the ground and staring gloomily and longingly at the lights of the village. And then a high, keening wail began. It was then that they looked down and saw the basket at their feet. There was a bundle in the basket, a bundle of oiled silk and woolen blankets, from the top of which protruded a red, bawling face with screwed-up little eyes, a mouth open and vocal and hungry. And there was, attached to the baby's blanket with a silver pin, a scrap of parchment upon which was written in an elegant, if slightly archaic, handwriting, the following words: Tristran Thorn. And now we've made it to section 2. So I'm going to go ahead and maybe we'll call it for today, unless you'd like to continue, in which case we can try. What time? Actually, we should continue. It's early, so we should continue. A lot of this was not in the movie. I think that, like, there was an interpretation of some of it in the movie. I would go as far as to say, but most of it is just not. So I think this part is, like, largely skipped over in the movie. I think that the only real bits of it that we get, yeah, like, the whole background information on stuff is like that they're allowed to go through the wall on May Day is completely skipped, because if you remember, um Dunstan initially just jumps the wall. It's not specified what day it was. All that's specified is that people don't normally cross the wall, and now he does. And he makes it into the fairgrounds and finds the lady. And then they do things. We sort of fade out at that point. And then there's a baby. And that's Ben Barnes' role in this movie. I think that the way that Dunstan is described in the book, he's not as described as attractive as Ben Barnes. I was like, I just said his name, but I guess they wanted someone who didn't just look average. I don't know. It's of my personal opinion that Ben Barnes is not an average-looking person. But he does resemble Charlie Cox enough. Charlie Cox, who plays Tristan. In the movie, they decided to take out the R from his name. It's not Tristran. In the movie, it's just Tristan. And so that worked. I hope so. Ben Barnes, if you're listening, you are not an average man. What a compliment. Like, so we'll get there. We'll get there. Don't spoil it for the people who haven't seen it or read it or anything. The next chapter is in which Tristran Thorn grows to manhood and makes a rash promise. Years passed. The next fairy market was held on schedule on the other side of the wall. Young Tristran Thorn, 8 years old, did not attend, finding himself packed off to stay with extremely distant relations in a village a day's ride away. His little sister Louisa, 6 months his junior, was, however, allowed to go to the market, and this was a source of great ranklement to the boy, as was the fact that Louisa brought back from the market a glass globe filled with speckles of light that glittered and flashed in the twilight, and which cast a warm and gentle radiance into the darkness of their bedroom in the farmhouse, while all Tristran brought back from his relatives was a nasty case of the measles. Shortly afterward, the farm cat had 3 kittens, 2 black and white ones like herself, and a tiny kitten with a dusty blue sheen to her coat and eyes that changed color depending on her mood, from green and gold to salmon, scarlet, and vermilion. Oh, wow. This kitten was given to Tristran to make up for missing the market. She grew slowly, the blue cat, and she was the sweetest cat in the world until one evening she began to prowl the house impatiently and to flash her eyes, which were the purple red of foxgloves. And when Tristran's father came back from a day in the fields, the cat yowled, bolted through the door, and was off into the dusk. The guards on the wall were for people, not cats, and Tristran, who was 12 by this time, never saw the blue cat again. He was inconsolable for a while. His father came into his bedroom one night and sat at the end of his bed, saying gruffly, "She'll be happier over the wall with her own kind. Don't you fret now, lad." His mother had said nothing to him about the matter, as she said little to him on any subject. Sometimes Tristran would look up to see his mother staring at him intently, as if she were trying to tease some secret from his face. Louisa, his sister, would needle him about this as they walked to the village school in the morning, as she would goad him about so many other things. The shape of his ears, for example. The right ear was flat against his head and almost pointed. The left one was not. And about the foolish things he said. Once he told her that the tiny clouds, fluffy and white, that clustered across the horizon at sunset as they walked home from school were sheep. It was no matter that he later claimed that he had meant simply that they reminded him of sheep, or that there was something fluffy and sheep-like about them. Louisa laughed and teased and goaded like a goblin. And what was worse, she told the other children and incited them to baa quietly whenever Tristran walked past. Louisa was a born inciter, and danced circles around her brother. The village school was a fine school, and under the tutelage of Mrs. Cherry, the school mistress, Tristran Thorn learned all about fractions and longitude and latitude. He could ask in French for the pen of the gardener's aunt, indeed for the pen of his own aunt. He learned the kings and queens of England from William the Conqueror, 1066, to Victoria, 1837. He learned his reading and had a fair copperplate hand. Travelers to the village were rare, but occasionally a peddler would come through the village selling penny dreadful accounts of grisly murders, fateful encounters, dire doings, and remarkable escapes. Most peddlers sold song sheets, 2 for a penny, and families would buy them and gather their pianos to sing songs such as Cherry Ripe and In My Father's Garden. So the days went by, and the weeks went by, and the years went by also. At age 14, by a process of osmosis, of dirty jokes, whispered secrets, and filthy ballads, Tristran learned of sex. When he was 15, he hurt his arm falling from the apple tree outside Mr. Thomas Forrester's house, more specifically from the apple tree outside Miss Victoria Forrester's bedroom window. To Tristran's regret, he had caught no more than a pink and tantalizing glimpse of Victoria, who was his sister's age, and without any doubt, the most beautiful girl for 100 miles around. By the time Victoria was 17, and Tristran also, she was in all probability, he was certain, the most beautiful girl in the British Isles. Tristran would have insisted on the most beautiful girl in the entire British Isles, if not the world, and boxed you, or been prepared to, had you argued with him. You would have been hard-pressed to find anyone in Wall who would have argued with him, though. She turned many heads and, in all probability, broke many hearts. A description. She had her mother's gray eyes and heart-shaped face, her father's curling chestnut hair. Her lips were red and perfectly shaped, her cheeks blushed prettily when she spoke. She was pale and utterly delightful. When she was 16, she had fought vigorously with her mother, for Victoria had taken it into her head that she would work in the 7th Magpie as a pot-maid. I have spoken to Mr. Bromios about this, she told her mother, and he has no objection. What Mr. Bromios thinks or does not think, replied her mother, the former Bridget Comfrey, is neither here nor there. That is a most improper occupation for a young lady. The village of Wall watched the battle of wills with fascinations, wondering what the outcome would be, for no one crossed Bridget Forrester. She had a tongue that could, the villagers said, blister the paint from a barn door and tear the bark from an oak. There is no one in the village who would have wanted to get on the wrong side of Bridget Forrester, and they did say that the wall would be more likely to walk than for Bridget Forrester to change her mind. Victoria Forrester, however, was used to having her own way, and if all else failed, or even if it did not, she would appeal to her father, and he would accede to her demands. But here even Victoria was surprised, for her father agreed with her mother, saying that working in the bar at the 7th Magpie was something that a well-brought-up young lady would not do. And Thomas Forrester set his chin, and there the matter ended. Every boy in the village was in love with Victoria Forrester, and many a sedate gentleman, quietly married with grey in his beard, would stare at her as she walked down the street, becoming, for a few moments, a boy once more, in the spring of his years, with a spring in his step. They say that Mr. Monday himself is counted amongst your admirers, said Louisa Thorne to Victoria Forrester one afternoon in May in the apple orchard. 5 girls sat beside and upon the branches of the oldest apple tree in the orchard, its huge trunk making a fine seat and support. And whenever the May breeze blew, the pink blossoms tumbled down like snow, coming to rest in their hair and on their skirts. The afternoon sunlight dappled green and silver and gold through the leaves of the apple orchard. Mr. Monday, said Victoria Forrester with disdain, is 40 years of age. Is 40 years of age if he is a day. She made a face to indicate just how old 40 is when you happen to be 17. Anyway, said his Cecilia Hemstock, Louise's cousin, has already been married. I would not wish to marry someone who had already been married. It would be, she opined, like having someone else break in one's own pony. Personally, I would imagine that to be the sole advantage of marrying a widower, said Amelia Robinson, that someone else would have removed the rough edges, broken him in, if you will. Also, I would imagine that by that age, his lusts would long since have been sated and abated, which would free one from a number of indignities. A flurry of hastily suppressed giggles amid the apple blossoms. Still, said Lucy Pippin hesitantly, it would be nice to live in the big house, and to have a couch and 4, and to be able to travel to London for the season, and to Bath to take the waters, or to Brighton for the sea bathing. Even if Mr. Monday is 45, the other girls shrieked and flung handfuls of apple blossom at her, and none shrieked more loudly or flung more blossom than Victoria Forrester. I'm just checking where we are. Hold on. Let's see. Okay. Tristran Thorn, at the age of 17 and only 6 months older than Victoria, was half the way between a boy and a man, and was equally uncomfortable in either role. He seemed to be composed chiefly of elbows and Adam's apples. His hair was the brown of sodden straw, and it stuck out at awkward 17-year-old angles. Wet and comb it, however so much he tried. He was painfully shy, which, as is often the manner of the painfully shy, he overcompensated for by being too loud at the wrong times. Boy, I understand that. Most days Tristran was content, or as content as a 17-year-old youth with his world ahead of him ever can be. And when he daydreamed in the fields or at the tall desk at the back of Monday and Brown's, the village shop, he fancied himself riding the train all the way to London or to Liverpool, or of taking a steamship across the grey Atlantic to America, and making his fortune there among the savages in the new lands. But there were times when the wind blew from beyond the wall, bringing with it the smell of mint and thyme and red currants, and at those times there was strange colors seen in the flames in the fireplaces of the village. When that wind blew, the simplest of devices, from lucifer matches to lantern slides, would no longer function. And at those times, Tristran Thorn's daydreams were strange, guilty fantasies, muddled and odd, of journeys through forests to rescue princesses from palaces, dreams of knights and trolls and mermaids. And when these moods came upon him, he would slip out of the house and lie upon the grass, and he would stare up at the stars. I'm just going to put this where I assume we'll stop. Few of us now have seen the stars as folks then see them. Few of us now have seen the stars as folks saw them then. Our cities and towns cast too much light into the night, but from the village of Wall, the stars were laid out like worlds or like ideas, uncountable as the trees in a forest or the leaves on a tree. Tristran would stare up into the darkness of the sky until he thought of nothing at all, and then he would go back to his bed and sleep like a dead man. He was a gangling creature of potential, a barrel of dynamite waiting for someone or something to light his fuse. But no one did, so on weekends and in the evenings he helped his father on the farms, and during the day he worked for Mr. Brown at Monday and Brown's as a clerk. Monday and Brown's was the village shop. While they kept a number of necessities in stock, much of their business was conducted by means of lists. Villagers would give Mr. Brown a list of what they needed, from potted meats to sheep dip, from fish knives to chimney tiles. A clerk at Monday and Brown's would compile a master list of everything requested, and then Mr. Monday would take the master list and a dray pulled by two huge shire horses, and he would set off for the nearest country town and return in a handful of days with a dray loaded high with goods of all description. It was a cold, blustery day in late October, of the kind that always seems about to rain, but never actually does, and it was late in the afternoon. Victoria Forrester walked into Monday and Brown's with a list written in her mother's precise handwriting, and she rang the small bell on the counter for service. She looked slightly disappointed to see Tristran Thorn appear from the back room. "Good day, Miss Forrester." She smiled a tight smile and handed Tristran her list. It read as follows: half a pound of sago, 10 cans of sardines, 1 bottle of mushroom ketchup, 5 pounds of rice, 1 tin of golden syrup, 2 pounds of currants, a bottle of cochineal, 1 pound of barley sugar, 1 shilling box of Roundtree's Elect Cocoa, 3D tin, 3. I'm trying to think what's it called? What D would stand for here. It seems to be a measurement. Probably missing something obvious. Because then there's 6D of Brunswick Black. And I'm not sure what it would be. Oh well, it's probably not that important. So 3D10 of Oki's knife polish, 6D of Brunswick Black, 1 packet of Swinburne's isinglass. Decibels. I don't think so. 1 packet of Swinburne's isinglass, 1 bottle of furniture cream, 1 basting ladle, a 9-penny gravy strainer, a set of chicken steps. I can't read. A set of kitchen steps. Tristran read it to himself, looking for something about which he could begin to talk, a conversational gambit of some kind, any kind. He heard his voice saying, "You'll be having rice pudding then, I would imagine, Miss Forrester." As soon as he said it, he knew it had been the wrong thing to say. Victoria pursed her perfect lips and blinked her grey eyes and said, "Yes, Tristran, we shall be having rice pudding." And then she smiled at him and said, "Mother says that rice pudding in sufficient quantity will help to stave off chills and colds and other autumnal ailments." "My mother," Tristran confessed, "has always sworn by tapioca pudding." He put the list on a spike. "We can deliver most of the provisions tomorrow morning, and the rest of it will come back with Mr. Monday early next week." There was a gust of wind, then so strong that it rattled the windows of the village, and whirled and spun the weathercocks until they could not tell north from west or south from east. The fire that was burning in the grate of Monday and Brown's belched and twisted in a flurry of greens and scarlets, topped with a fizz of silver twinkles, of the kind one can make for oneself at the parlor fire with a handful of tossed iron filings. Tossed iron filings, rather. The wind blew from Fairy and the east, and Tristran Thorn suddenly found himself. The wind blew from Fairy and the east, and Tristran Thorn suddenly found inside himself a certain amount of courage he had not suspected that he had possessed. "You know, Miss Forrester, I get off in a few minutes," he said. "Perhaps I could walk you a little way home? It's not much out of my way." And he waited, his heart in his mouth, while Victoria Forrester's grey eyes stared at him, amused. After what seemed like 100 years, she said, "Certainly." Tristran hurried into the parlor and informed Mr. Brown that he would be off now, and Mr. Brown grunted in a not entirely ill-natured way and told Tristran that when he was younger, he'd not only had to stay late each night and shut up the shop, but that he had also had to sleep on the floor beneath the counter with only his coat for a pillow. Tristran agreed that he was indeed a lucky young man, and he wished Mr. Brown a good night. Then he took his coat from the coat stand and his new bowler hat from the hat stand and stepped out onto the cobblestones where Victoria Forrester waited for him. Honestly, that is just the best. Like, that's the only response you can give to people like that. Just, yes, I certainly have it great. Anyway, goodbye. The autumn twilight turned into deep and early night as they walked. Tristran could smell the distant winter on the air, a mixture of night mist and crisp darkness, and the tang of fallen leaves. They took a winding lane up towards the Forrester farm, and the crescent moon hung white in the sky, and the stars burned in the darkness above them. "Victoria," said Tristran after a while. "Yes, Tristran," said Victoria, who had been preoccupied for much of the walk. Would you think it forward of me to kiss you?" said Tristran. "Yes," said Victoria bluntly and coldly, "very forward." "Ah," said Tristran. Right. They walked up Dighty's hill, not speaking. At the top of the hill, they turned and saw beneath them the village of Wall, all gleaming candles and lamps glimmering through windows, warm yellow lights that beckoned and invited. And above them the lights of the myriad stars, which glittered and twinkled and blazed, chilly and distant and more numerous than the mind could encompass. Tristran reached down his hand and took Victoria's small hand in his. She did not pull away. "Did you see that?" asked Victoria, who was gazing out of the landscape. "I saw nothing," said Tristran. "I was looking at you." Victoria smiled in the moonlight. You are the most lovely woman in all the world," said Tristran from the bottom of his heart. "Get along with you," said Victoria, but she said it gently. "What did you see?" asked Tristran. "A falling star," said Victoria. "I believe they are not at all uncommon at this time of year." "Vicky," said Tristran, "will you kiss me?" "No," she said. "You kissed me when we were younger. You kissed me beneath the pledge oak on your 15th birthday. And you kissed me last May Day behind your father's cowshed." "I was another person then," she said, "and I shall not kiss you, Tristran Thorn." "If you will not kiss me," asked Tristran, "will you marry me?" "Tristran, are you kidding me?" There was silence on the hill, only the rustle of the October wind, then a twinkling sound. It was the sound of the most beautiful girl in the whole of the British Isles, laughing with delight and amusement. "Marry you?" she repeated incredulously. "And why ever should I marry you, Tristran Thorn? What could you give me?" "Give you?" he said. "I would go to India for you, Victoria Forrester, and bring you the tusks of elephants, and pearls as big as your thumb, and rubies the size of wren's eggs. I would go to America, all the way to San Francisco, to the gold fields, and I would not come back until I had your weight in gold. Then I would carry it back here, and lay it at your feet. I would travel to the distant Northlands, did you but say the word, and slay the mighty polar bears, and bring you back their hides." "I think you were doing quite well," said Victoria Forrester, "until you got to the bit about slaying polar bears. Be that as it may, little shop boy and farm boy, I shall not kiss you, neither shall I marry you." Tristran's eyes blazed in the moonlight. "I would travel to far Cathay for you, and bring you a huge junk I would capture from the king of the pirates, laden with jade and silk and opium. I would go to Australia at the bottom of the world," said Tristran, "and bring you, He ransacked the penny dreadfuls in his head, trying to remember if any of their heroes had visited Australia. "A kangaroo," he said. "And opals," he added. He was fairly sure about the opals. Victoria Forrester squeezed his hand. "And whatever would I do with a kangaroo?" she asked. "Now we should be getting along, or my father and mother will be wondering what has kept me, and they will leap to some entirely unjustified conclusions. For I have not kissed you, Tristran Thorn. Kiss me," he pleaded. "There is nothing I would do not for your kiss. No mountain I would not scale, no river I would not ford, no desert I would not cross." Tristran, you're given serious desperation here, buddy. You need to, slow, chill out. He gestured widely, indicating the village of Wall below them, the night sky above them, In the constellation of Orion, low on the eastern horizon, a star flashed and glittered and fell. For a kiss and the pledge of your hand, said Tristran grandiloquently, I would bring you that fallen star. He shivered. His coat was thin, and it was obvious he would not get his kiss, which he found puzzling. The manly heroes of the penny dreadfuls and shilling novels never had these problems getting kissed. Go on, then, said Victoria. And if you do, I will. What? Said Tristran. If you bring me that star, said Victoria, the one that just fell, not another star, then I'll kiss you. Who knows what else I might do. There. Now you need not go to Australia, nor to Africa, nor to far Cathay. What? Said Tristran. And Victoria laughed at him then, and looked back, and took back her hand, and began to walk down the hill toward her father's farm. Tristran ran to catch up to her. Do you mean it? He asked her. I mean it as much as you mean all your fancy words of rubies and gold and opium, she replied. What is an opium? Something in cough mixture, said Tristran, like eucalyptus. It does not sound particularly romantic, said Victoria Forrester. Anyway, should you not be running off to retrieve my fallen star? It fell to the east, over there. And she laughed again. Silly shop boy, it is all you can do to ensure that we have the ingredients for rice pudding. And if I brought you the fallen star, said Tristran lightly, what would you give me? A kiss? Your hand in marriage? Anything you desire, said Victoria, amused. You swear it? Asked Tristran. They were walking the last 100 yards now, up to the Forrester's farmhouse. The windows burned with lamplight, yellow and orange. Of course, said Victoria, smiling. The track of the Forrester's farm was bare mud, trodden into mire by the feet of horses and cows and sheep and dogs. Tristran Thorn went down on his knees in the mud, heedless of his coat or his woolen trousers. Very well, he said. The wind blew from the east then. I shall leave you here, my lady, said Tristran Thorn, for I have urgent business to the east. He stood up, unmindful of the mud and mire clinging to his knees and coat, and he bowed to her, and then he doffed his bowler hat. Victoria Forrester laughed at the skinny shop boy, laughed long and loud and delightfully, and her tinkling laughter followed him back down the hill and away. Tristran Thorn ran all the way home. Brambles snagged at his clothes as he ran, and a branch knocked his hat from his head. He stumbled, breathless and torn, into the kitchen of the house on Westward Meadows. Look at the state of you, said his mother. Indeed, I never did. Tristran merely smiled at her. Tristran? Asked his father, who at 35 was still middling tall and still freckled, although there were more than a few silvering hairs in his nut-brown curls. Your mother spoke to you. Did you not hear her? I beg your pardon, mother, said Tristran, but I shall be leaving the village tonight. I may be gone for some time. Foolishness and silliness, said Daisy Thorn. I never heard such nonsense. But Dunstan Thorn saw a look in his son's eyes. Let me talk to him, he said to his wife. She looked at him sharply, then she nodded. Very well, she said. But who's going to sew up the boy's coat? That's what I would like to know. She bustled out of the kitchen. The kitchen fire fizzed in silver and glimmered green and violet. Where are you going? Asked Dunstan. East, said his son, rather. East, his father nodded. There were two easts, east to the next country, through the forest, and east on the other side of the wall. So it's interesting. There were two easts. He says it with a lowercase e, and he says east with a lowercase e to the next country through the forest, and then east with a capital E to the other side of the wall. Dunstan Thorn knew without asking to which his son was referring. And will you be coming back? Asked his father. Tristran grinned widely. Of course, he said. Well, said his father, that's all right then. He scratched his nose. Have you given any thought of getting through the wall? Tristran shook his head. I'm sure I can find a way, he said. If necessary, I'll fight my way past the guards. His father sniffed. You'll do no such thing, he said. How would you like it if it was you on duty, or me? I'll not see anyone hurt. He scratched the side of his nose once more. Go and pack a bag and kiss your mother goodbye, and I'll walk you down to the village. Tristran packed a bag, and his mother brought him 6 red, ripe apples and a cottage loaf and a round of white farmhouse cheese, which he placed inside his bag. Mrs. Thorn would not look at Tristran. He kissed her cheek and bade her farewell. Then he walked into the village with his father. Tristran had stood his first watch on the wall when he was 16 years old. He had only been given one instruction, that it was the task of the guards to prevent anyone from coming through the gap in the wall of the village, by any means possible. If it was not possible to prevent them, then the guards must raise the village for help. He wondered as they walked what his father had in mind. Perhaps the two of them together could overpower the guards. Perhaps his father would create some kind of distraction and allow him to slip through. Perhaps. By the time they walked through the village and arrived at the gap in the wall, Tristran had imagined every possibility except the one which occurred. On wall duty that evening were Harold Crutchbeck and Mr. Bromios. On wall duty that evening were Harold Crutchbeck and Mr. Bromios. Harold Crutchbeck Crutchbeck was a husky young man, several years older than Tristran, the miller's son. Mr. Bromios' hair was black and curled, and his eyes were green, and his smile was white, and he smelled of grapes and of grape juice, of barley and hops. Dunstan Thorn walked up to Mr. Bromios and stood in front of him. He stamped his feet against the evening chill. Evening, Mr. Bromios. Evening, Harold, said Dunstan. Evening, Mr. Thorn, said Harold Crutchbeck. Good evening, Dunstan, said Mr. Bromios. I trust you are well. Dunstan allowed as that he was, and they spoke of the weather and agreed that it would be bad for the farmers, and that, from the quantity of holly berries and yew berries already apparent, it would be a cold, hard winter. As he listened to them talking, Tristran was ready to burst with irritation and frustration, but he bit his tongue and said nothing. Finally, his father said, Mr. Bromios, Harold, I believe you both know my son Tristran. Tristran raised his bowler hat to them nervously, and then his father said something he did not understand. I suppose you both know about where he came from, said Dunstan Thorn. Mr. Bromios nodded without speaking. Harold Crutchbeck said he had heard tales, although you never should mind the half of what you hear. Well, it's true, said Dunstan, and now it's time for him to go back. There's a star, Tristran began to explain, but his father hushed him to silence. Mr. Bromios rubbed his chin and ran a hand through his thatch of black curls. Very well, he said. He turned and spoke to Harold in a low voice, saying things Tristran could not hear. His father pressed something cold into his hand. Go on with you, boy. Go and bring back your star, and may God and all his angels go with you. And Mr. Bromios and Harold Crutchbeck, the guards on the gate, stood aside to let him pass. Tristran walked through the gap, with the stone wall on each side of him, into the meadow on the other side of the wall. Turning, he looked back at the 3 men framed in the gap, and wondered why they had allowed him through. Then, his bag swinging in one hand, the object his father had pushed into his hand in the other, Tristran Thorn set off up the gentle hill towards the woods. As he walked, the chill of the night grew less, and once in the woods at the top of the hill, Tristran was surprised to realize the moon was shining brilliantly down on him through a gap in the trees. He was surprised because the moon had set an hour before, and doubly surprised because the moon the moon that had set had been a slim, sharp silver crescent, and the moon that had shone down on him now was a huge golden harvest moon, full and glowing and deeply colored. The cold thing in his hand chimed once, a crystalline tinkling, and like the bells of a tiny glass cathedral. He opened his hand and held it up to the moonlight. It was a snowdrop, made all of glass. A warm wind stroked Tristran's face. It smelled like peppermint and blackcurrant leaves, and red, ripe plums, and the enormity of what he had done descended on Tristran Thorn. He was walking into Fairy in search of a fallen star, with no idea how he would find the star, nor how to keep himself safe and whole as he tried. He looked back and fancied that he could see the lights of wall behind him, wavering and glimmering as if in a heat haze, but still inviting. And he knew that if he turned around and went back, no one would think any less of him for it. Not his father, not his mother, not even Victoria Forrester would likely as not merely smile at him the next time she saw him and call him shop boy and add that stars once fallen often proved difficult in finding. He paused then. He thought of Victoria's lips and her gray eyes and the sound of her laughter. He straightened his shoulders, placed the crystal snowdrop in the top buttonhole of his coat, now undone, and too ignorant to be scared, too young to be awed, Tristran Thorn passed beyond the fields we know and into fairy. And that is where we will stop today. Right at the start of our third chapter. Let us talk. Oh. What do we think about it so far? Yeah, the movie focused a lot more on Tristan. That I say Tristan because in the movie they call him Tristan. Than it did on Dunstan. Dunstan's only there for a couple of minutes. I mean, he's there for longer, but we only see him young for like a couple of minutes. I'm glad. I know that we're really only kind of in like introductory mode still, but we've got some groundwork laid. I'm glad you guys are enjoying it. Are there any questions or anything you guys want to talk about? Poor Ben Barnes. What do you mean, poor Ben Barnes? Because he was only in the movie for a small amount of time? Is that what you mean? I mean, he had other things that he was doing then. He was Prince Caspian in the Chronicles of Narnia. He was also everybody's Sirius Black in their fan casting of what the Marauders would have looked like younger in Harry Potter. Yeah, like I said, there's a lot of this that isn't in the movie too. So there's some of it that that you might not be forgetting. It just wasn't there. I don't know that I ever paid particular attention to the Narnia soundtrack. Is it good? I've seen Narnia, but I just don't remember. I'm like really tired. I hate winter. I mean, me too. But the thing is that there is just flat a lot of stuff that is not in the movie. Portions that related. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. There'll be stuff that they like reference in the movie, but like it's not shown. And then there's stuff that just it doesn't make it in at all. I still like it. Like I say that I still really like the adaptation that we got of Stardust. But there is a lot that just from the original book was not included. Yeah. Mm. Does anyone have anything else that they'd like to talk about? Yeah, you're right about that. Because, like, I'm not, like, the biggest fan of snow anymore. But at the same time, it's pretty. And, like, it'd be nice if we were going to have this weather if it would at least snow. Yeah. I hate it. Yes. I mean, I hate that snow is a big inconvenience for that stuff. But it looks nice. I've said before that my wish is to get snow that's like here and then melts within the day. So it can look really nice and then just be gone and not inconvenience anyone. mm. Um yeah, is there anything else that you guys wanted to talk about from the story or what we've read so far rather? I have a feeling that Mr. Bromios is from Beyond the Wall. Just the way he's described, there's something about him. Melted snow is like slush. Ugh. Is the worst. All gray and slippery. I can't say if anything does. I can't spoil things. We're just gonna have to see. Aside from that, is there anything that you guys are wondering or I can talk about things that have already happened. Like elaborate as much as I can on things and like stuff like that. But of course I can't talk about like stuff that might happen in the future of the story. Okay. No, they're not. I don't think that the movie liked the idea of the infidelity, to be honest. So Dunstan has his relations with the fairy lady, and then he doesn't even seem to get married after that. He lives alone with Tristan in the movie. And yeah, it's weird. I get it. I think it was supposed to show that he wasn't truly happy with Daisy Hempstock and was just kind of like going with the flow of things. And sometimes that can take you a far way. Like, you might think, oh, well, he got married and he had a kid and, like, they're still together. And it's like, there are people that do that. Like, there are people that, like, it doesn't truly feel right for them, but they think that that is what they should want or what they should have. And they stay with people that aren't really right for them or aren't really what they want because they can't imagine why they're not what they want and why it's not right. So, yeah, like, I think that's what happened there. Ooh, sorry. Gosh, I'm so yawny. Well, alrighty then, guys. If we are done, then I think I'm gonna call it for today. I don't know if we'll be having a stream next week, but I will see. Because things are kind of gonna be a little all over for a little while. Like, we'll see what happens, though. I will leave. It's okay. I'll leave information on my social media for that, and we'll know. But for now, we'll sign off with the assumption that maybe we'll be having something next week. So yeah. So keep your eyes peeled, and we'll see what happens. But for now, of course, no problem. Of course, this has been Sky.